Okay, welcome to another episode of the Caroline Glick Middle East News Hour. I think this week we're going to be going online with this show on Holocaust Memorial Day on Yom HaShoah. And there's been a lot going on in Europe, obviously the war in Ukraine, the French elections, and many other developments. And I thought that on this week, it would be a really good idea for me to sit down and talk with Eldad Beck. Eldad Beck is the European Affairs correspondent for Israel Hayom, and he's really one of the most important thought leaders, at least for me, in Israel on what's going on in Europe. And I always make it a point to read his articles and to listen to him when I get the opportunity. So I could think of no one better to bring on this week than Eldad. And so first of all, hey, Eldad, how are you doing? Thanks so much for joining me this week.
Thank you very much, Caroline. It's a pleasure to be with you. And also a pleasure to be again in Paris, despite the results of the election.
Despite the results of the election. So, well, I mean, it was sort of largely expected that President Macron was going to be reelected and that Marine Le Pen would again be defeated as she was in 2017. So how do you look at the elections? I mean, on the face of it, it looks like it's a landslide, right? 50% to 41%.
What's worrying me is somebody who spent 10 beautiful years in Paris and saw how this country is changing radically and not for the good side. In the last years, we have seen that there is a mounting sense of discontent of large segments of the French population coming from the right side, but also coming from the left side. We have seen actually in the last 5 years, the period of the presidency of Macron, a period of incessant crises of the French society. There has been really a period of unprecedented period, I would say, of instability in the history of the Fifth Republic here in France. And what we have seen in the last 2 weeks, in the first and second round of presidential election, is the fact that people are mainly voting because they hate somebody and not because they are for somebody. And I think that this was very clear yesterday in the victory of Macron, that he based his victory on the fact that there are more people who are anti-Le Pen and her party and her family than people who are for Macron. And I mean, we've seen it immediately after the announcement of the results of the election. Activists of the radical left, whose candidate came third on the first round, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is extremely anti-Israeli, very BDS person, they went out to the streets and started demonstrating violently against the re-election of Macron, which means that, and we have to add to that the fact that Mélenchon already started the campaign for the parliamentary elections that are going to take place in coming June, with the hope that he will have a majority that will force Macron to nominate him as a prime minister.
But I don't really understand. Can before you go into it, I don't really understand the French system. I thought, first of all, if he came in third and Le Pen came in second, I read that she was supposed to be the prime minister. So how does it work there? Who decides who the prime minister is? How is that done? And also, in the presidential elections, were they matched by parliamentary elections? What's the balance of forces inside of the French parliament? And finally, if you can just explain for me and other people who aren't as familiar with the French political system, what is the balance of power between the president and the prime minister and the government?
Right. This is quite a complex of questions. First of all, the president is the person who decides who is going to be the prime minister. And normally it has to do with the results of the parliamentary elections, which take place in the new system, in the new political system of France a couple of weeks after the presidential elections. We have to remember that in the past, the presidential period lasted 7 years, then they have decided to cut it into 5 years. Actually, it has been so in the last 20 years. And in this format of political system, the presidential election is being followed by the parliamentary election, so that the president would be able to have a majority that would enable him to govern, which was really the case 5 years ago. We strangely and unbelievingly enough, despite the fact that Macron didn't really have a party, but more a movement, which was not structured and not rooted very much in the political landscape of France, he managed to get a majority, a very comfortable majority in the parliamentary election as well, which helped him in a way, it was not an absolute majority, helped him in a way to progress on certain things, but he was forced to make alliances with other parties. Now, the party of Le Pen, the whole phenomenon of Le Pen is an extremely problematic phenomenon, because it's like the slogan, not left, not right. 5 years ago, when he emerged out of nothing, he finished the Socialist Party. And this year, he actually managed to smash the Republican Party, which is the conservative party in France. So what we have is an absolutely smashed traditional political system with a person who nobody really knows what is his ideology. Sometimes he goes to the left, sometimes he goes to the right. He is a big ideological mishmash. This is how he has been governing France in the last 5 years. Now, the question is what's going to happen in June in the 2 rounds of parliamentary elections, because I see with difficulty a situation where Macron's party is going to have a majority again, because as I said before, the discontent, the public discontent with the way Macron has presided over France in the last 5 years is extremely big. So
I saw that there was a very low voter turnout rate yesterday. That I don't know, 3 million less people voted yesterday than voted in 2017. Just extraordinarily low participation rates.
28% of those who could have voted didn't go to vote, and this is the second largest number of abstention since the foundation of the Fifth Republic. The biggest number of non-participation in the election was in '69, and this really shows how people are disappointed with the policies of Macron and with the whole political system in France. We also have to take into account the fact that actually you have a voting system which is not representative, meaning that there are always 2 rounds. In the first round, every party can send a candidate, but in the second round, only the 2 first candidates who made it through the first round of vote of election participate in the election, which means that at the end of the day, most of what we had in the election here, during the first round of votes, Macron had 28% of the votes. Le Pen had something like 23, which means that altogether they have had 51% of the votes, meaning that half of the French population, 49, could not really express its political wish in the second round, but they had either to choose somebody they feel close to or somebody they want to support in order to block and stop somebody else, which was the case with Le Pen.
Well, in theory, isn't that supposed to be the big tent theory of politics? I mean, I'm just looking at the data that I got here. It's 13 million French people didn't go to vote, and 3 million that went to vote put in a blank slip of paper to show that they didn't want either of the candidates. But I mean, in theory, it's like the two big parties in the United States that they're supposed to, they're supposed to be big tent parties. And so the idea of a second round is, okay, you get out, you go ideological the first round, but the second round, okay, you have to compromise. You have to figure out, of the people that aren't perfect for you, which one best. And then they, by virtue of the fact that you have this limited choice, they also have to govern in a manner that encompasses people who, they have to be much more responsible to people who are not as ideologically aligned with them as they are with others. I mean, that's the idea, I guess, behind a second round, right?
Probably, and they also wanted to avoid political instability. The whole of Europe after the Second World War was quite in turmoil, and each country found a system which enabled it to fight the extremes from the left and from the right in order to enable the traditional central party from the parties from the left and to the right make it to govern the countries. But what we see in France in the last 5 years is, first of all, the disappearance of the big bloc on the left, which used to be the Socialist Party. And nowadays we see the disappearance of the big bloc of the right, which was the Republican Party. And instead of that, we have three blocs, which are the radical left on one side, headed by Mélenchon, the national right, headed by Le Pen, and one has to say that the fact that she got almost 42% of the voters this week is a very significant development for her political camp, because if you think about the fact that her father, who candidated against Jacques Chirac 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, got less than 18% in the second round. And here is Marine Le Pen with almost 42%. This is a radical change. And between these two poles, there is this big mishmash of ideas of Macron, which nobody really is able to place ideologically. And I tend to believe that what we are going to see in the parliamentary elections in June, which are also going to take place in two rounds, is strengthening the extremes on both sides. But we have a problem with the national right in France, because there is the fight between Le Pen and Eric Zemmour, the Jewish journalist who wanted to unite the right parties in France and actually became more radical than Le Pen in the eyes of many, and the Republicans who are objecting both Le Pen and Zemmour and are supporting Macron, while as the left seems to join forces around Mélenchon, and we really are running a risk of finding ourselves with a radical left-wing majority or almost majority in the coming election, which is going to be extremely problematic for Israel, because Mélenchon is the French version of Corbyn. And that is really bad news for Israel.
All right. Well, I want to get to Mélenchon and the left-wing anti-Semitism and hatred for Israel. But I think in a way to get there, we should go first to the fragmentation of the right, because a lot of the things that you're talking about here resonate what's happening with the Republicans versus the Democrats in the United States, with the Democrats being overtaken by their radicals, and they're becoming a very post-American, culturally Marxist political force in the United States. It's really governing all the major institutions in America. And then you have on the Republican side, you have people as diverse as Mitt Romney, and on sort of the left center, and Trump, Governor DeSantis in Florida, and then further along, Marjorie Taylor Greene and others. And so, you have, and the never Trump Republicans played a significant role in undermining the Trump presidency, and then in bringing the Democrats into power, particularly in the congressional elections in 2018. And here in Israel, of course, our left-wing government could never have come into existence had it not been for around 20 mandates, 20 seats in the Knesset that are occupied by members of anti-Netanyahu, ostensibly right-wing parties, Avigdor Lieberman's party, Gideon Sa'ar's party, and Naftali Bennett's party, and they preferred to form the most radical government in Israeli history with the left to avoid or to prevent Benjamin Netanyahu from serving another term as prime minister. So, we're seeing these fragmentations on the political right here in Israel and in the United States, and I find it interesting that it's happening as well in France. I mean, where do you see the fault lines forming on the French right that have, that brought Eric Zemmour into the race against Le Pen, and the Republicans on the other hand? What are they fighting over? What is it that they can't rally around, or that they refuse to be part of together?
Yeah, well, there are two things I want to answer in relation to your question. One has to do with France, one has to do with Europe as a whole. First of all, as to the fights among the national rights in France, there are two things. Eric Zemmour came into politics because he had the feeling that Le Pen was pushing too much towards the center and the left, and Le Pen herself said it very openly. She said, I'm not ashamed of declaring that my policies today are social, which means that she understood and she saw in recent elections that a large segment of the electorate that was voting for her was actually coming from the poorer sections of the French society, because they couldn't find anybody who would express their discontent with their living conditions. And they added to that their animosity towards immigrants coming from both the Middle East and from other parts of Europe. And they found in Le Pen the ideal answer, because she was combining both national and social combination.
I mean, it's very similar to Trump, right? And his transformation of the Republican Party into a party that's also for the disaffected and the disenfranchised working class of the Rust Belt and places like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Zemmour said she's going too far towards the center left, and because of that, she is abandoning ideas that were extremely important for the national rights. She also, we saw
Like
it-
what? Like what? Like, or is he elitist, or what? He doesn't want to help the working class in France? What
well,
was that?
his position on economy is much less social and much more neoliberal in many senses. And he really wants to, I mean, he understands the necessity to build a social structure, a solid social structure in France, but he says that one should not become too socialist in doing that, which is, according to him, the case of Marine Le Pen. There is also the fact that she lowered, first of all, she changed absolutely her position on the question of the euro and the European Union, meaning that she abandoned her idea of Frexit, and she was not that vocal with her critics criticizing the European Union, which are both issues that are extremely important to Eric Zemmour. And then on the issues of immigration, she was not as vocal and evident as she used to be in previous elections.
It sounds like, I mean, again, my lack of familiarity with French politics is substantial, but it seems what's left. I mean, so okay, so she wants to help working class French people, but she doesn't want. But it sounds like she's adopted much less nationalist positions. So what are the positions of the National Front on things like that? I know that she's not for getting involved or for diminishing significantly the involvement of NATO with Ukraine and trying to develop much more cooperative to the point of almost wondering what she's up to, relations with Putin and Russia. But so what is her emphasis then? Why, if she doesn't want to leave the EU,
Well, her emphasis is, first of all, regarding the EU, that they want
and immigration as well. I mean, that was the other one that you mentioned.
They want to create Europe of the nations and not the United States of Europe. And this is an idea that you have not only here in France, but also in other European parties, an idea that is pushed forward by the national right parties in different countries around the continent, meaning that the issue of sovereignty would remain with the hands of the national governments. And what we are going to have is a return to the European joint market.
The common market. So it's
EU
more like a confederation than a federation. That rather than being a United States, it's more like it's more like the United States under the Articles of Confederation, which gave much more power to the individual states, so that it would be a way to restore sovereign rights of each European country while having a superstructure that enables proper economic management of the whole. Is that basically what they're looking at?
The second thing is her opposition to globalization outside the EU, meaning that at the end of the day, the French should buy French products. The French should work in French companies and French enterprises. And those companies and enterprises should not be producing things abroad and bring them back to France.
So how do the Republicans view that? Because that seems to me to be a very non-extreme and very reasonable way of looking at things, that people like Sarkozy in the 2007 election seem to also be moving towards. So what do Republicans think of that idea, of her ideas?
I think that the Republicans have, well, they are in a terrible leadership crisis. And we have been seeing it in the last, I would say, almost 10 years. It mainly has to do with the fact that the last president of the Republican Party, Sarkozy, has very bitter feelings towards the fact that he feels abandoned by his own party, especially with all the legal problems that he has. And he played a very central role in actually strengthening Macron's position with giving him support of Republicans who didn't see a future for their own party. So we have there, first of all, a leadership problem. Then we have an ideological problem. There is nothing visible that you can define as a Republican ideology or Republican program. So, and this is exactly what we saw with the election, with the presidential election. Those who represent nowadays the French right are coming from the national camp, which means more right to the right. And this was reflected by the results of the elections. Now, there is something else that I want to say about on the European level, and that is that we see this fragmentation of the right, not only here in France. If you look at Germany, it's exactly the same situation. Merkel, in her very long 16 years of governing Germany, actually took out of the Conservative Party everything that was conservative and became much more center-left in order to attract voters from this political arena. And that actually enabled her to stay that long in power, because at the end of the day, she never really won an election as in a real victory. She always had to do compromises with her main rivals, the Social Democrats, and she did best at taking ideas from the Social Democrats and the Greens as well and implementing them, thus actually destroying completely the Conservative Party or parties in Germany. And we have seen it not only in the last general election in September that took place in Germany, we also see it on the local level. We just had a local election in Rheinland-Pfalz, where the Conservatives took a really big blow. We are going to have, beginning of May, another very important regional election where the Conservatives are going to lose control of one of Germany's most important lender, and the German Conservatives are completely lost. This is a situation that we have here in France. This is also a situation that we have maybe in a lesser proportion, but one cannot ignore the fact that the Conservative Party in England has been fighting itself in the last decade in a way that, despite the fact that they won the election, I mean, winning the last general election had to do with the Brexit more than it had to do with conservative ideas. So
well, it also had to do with people being terrified of Corbyn, who's an out and out, communist, who,
to a certain extent, yeah.
I mean, it was also about that. Right?
It's like in France, they were voting against somebody and not for somebody. So you have a situation in Western Europe, mainly in the big countries. Spain is another example, where the right hasn't been able really to rule or to win an election for a very long period.
Well, I mean, I think that does bring us to Yom HaShoah, and that does bring us to the Holocaust, because there's something, the United States was different from Europe, because you saw if you just even compare the French Revolution to the American Revolution, you see that what sprang up from both were very, very different conceptions of the role of government in the lives of men. And you didn't have this kind of concept of limited government. You had a concept of what a totalitarian government should do, and I think in a way, or not in a way, I mean, my contention is that fascism and communism are both the legitimate children of the French Revolution. I mean, the sort of Rousseauian totalitarian was a his common good or whatever. It was a proto-totalitarian. And in America, you had a completely different form of political organization that was based much more on the British Enlightenment than the French Enlightenment or Reformation. And so you look at all of what's happening, and you see this kind of the European right-wing parties, particularly, obviously, it's most notable in Germany, but they have this monkey on their shoulder, which is the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And whether you can have a healthy nationalism or patriotism or whatever you want to call it, that is not going to end up becoming, Nazi. And on the other hand, with the left, I mean, we're seeing it now in the United States that the left has become Europeanized, that it's become very totalitarian, it's become very tyrannical. But you have, I think that one of the pathologies of the right in Europe in particular is that they have this very uncomfortable relationship with ideology, that they're not quite sure what they're allowed to embrace and what they're not allowed to embrace. And I don't know, I would love to get your thoughts on that, but that the Holocaust also is hanging over their heads as something that makes it difficult for them to embrace people who have a similar, if not identical, vision of their national survival and where it lies.
Well, you see it very evidently in Germany, where my impression after living in Germany for 20 years is that the Germans didn't really do a deep and serious soul searching regarding what happened during Second World War and what actually brought to this terrible phenomenon, which means that the Germans were forced after World War on both sides of Germany to express certain ideas, but I really do not think that they understood what happened to them. I don't really think that they worked deeply enough and seriously enough the consequences of what happened. They keep on saying the right things, but I don't think that it comes from within. Okay, they know that they have to say it, so they say it, but they don't really realize. I always go back to the incident that I had about 10 years ago in a private university in Berlin. I was invited actually to help students in a project to improve Israel's public relations. They wanted to hear from me about the press coverage. And it was 2012, it was immediately after the Gaza operation of that year. I brought them reports of German newspapers on this operation. And I remind you that 2012 was also a period of the Arab Spring. So I enabled them to compare the quantity of reports about what was happening between Israel and Gaza and the lack of reporting about the horrible things that were happening in the Arab world. And then I asked them if they could tell me what's wrong with the reporting, and strangely or interestingly enough, they came up exactly with what I would say. I didn't have to add anything. And then I came to them with the question, why is there such an intensive reporting on the Israel or the Palestinian Arab conflict with Israel? And these students coming from good families, meaning having finished German schools, being brought up in families that can allow them to go into private university, gave me three answers. The first one was there are many Jews in Germany, and the number went up to 1 million. There are hardly 200,000. And before the Holocaust, there was something like 600,000, then never 1 million. Secondly, they said there are too many Jews in German politics, which is also absolutely false, because in the Bundestag, which is quite a rare phenomenon in Europe, you don't have Jewish presence. And then they came up and said there are too many Jews in the media, which is also extremely wrong. And I gave them, I made them understand why they were wrong. Now, these three anti-Semitic ideas, coming from younger Germans, show that actually they had absolutely no idea what's anti-Semitism. And why? Because they have never learned anything about anti-Semitism. For them and for many in Germany and in Europe, anti-Semitism is 6 million dead Jews, is Auschwitz. It's not the way that brought to Auschwitz or to the Holocaust. They know absolutely nothing about it. So this is where the problem is, and I think that this problem, you see it in many other places in Europe, in Western and Eastern Europe. People do not know what's anti-Semitism, and they have wrong ideas about what's anti-Semitism. And this is also why when they make anti-Semitic remarks about Israel, it's very easy to them, because they're not talking about Jews, they're talking about Israel. So nobody can actually accuse them of being anti-Semitic. Look what happened with the BDS resolution of the Bundestag. Quite an amazing thing. It's a very typical German thing. As you know, 2018, the Bundestag was the first parliament in the world to adopt a decision defining the BDS movement as anti-Semitic, and calling the authorities in Germany not to give any financial support or other support to BDS activities and activists. And that was praised as a world premiere, which enabled other parliaments around the world to do exactly the same. But immediately after this resolution was adopted, a war started against this resolution, led by BDS supporters, many of them Israelis, many of them Jews. And what they came up with as an argument was that actually by adopting this resolution, they are violating the German constitution and the idea of freedom of opinion and of expression. And they went to court with this idea, and they won. And because they won, actually, the resolution of the Bundestag has absolutely no meaning, not a legal meaning and not a moral meaning, which means that actually today there is a Bundestag resolution saying that the BDS is anti-Semitic, but there is a decision of a high court here in Germany that says the BDS is part of the freedom of expression, meaning actually that anti-Semitism in Germany is part of the freedom of expression. Now, you ask yourself, how come Germany, a state, a country that is pretending to have learned the lessons of the past, come to this situation?
Well, it's interesting what you're saying on so many different levels, obviously, and it really does adhere to the basic concept that there has been absolutely no reckoning whatsoever with anti-Semitism in Europe, and that so much of what's coming out in terms of everybody beating their chests and saying, "Oh yeah, we're going to fight anti-Semitism," is just a lie. But it's kind of the trivialization of everything having to do with Holocaust Remembrance that we see on the January 27th International Day of Holocaust Remembrance. But yeah, and it reminds me, when I was in graduate school at Harvard, there was an Austrian woman who was studying with me, and I don't remember how we even got onto it. We were having a very boring conversation about nothing much whatsoever. And she blurted out that she was so sick and tired of having to talk about the Holocaust all the time. Like, well, what do you say about the Holocaust? You know, I mean, like, what are you talking about? Oh, we keep having to apologize. I said, well, I mean, and then she went on, and it was clear that she had no real moral concern with what happened in the Holocaust, or why anybody would think that it was important for Austrians to take seriously what had happened. And you know, it goes on, and you see it everywhere. I mean, as you were expressing with these kids from good families who come to university and they spout anti-Semitic canards, and they don't even realize that they're doing it while they're doing it. They don't know. And it's sort of this superficialization of the discourse, which in a way shouldn't make it easier for all of the people on the right to get together and do something. Because if nothing matters, if all of their ideas are, you know, a millimeter deep and just very loudly professed, then why do they care so much about not working with one another? I mean, they don't actually really care about ideas. They don't care about this one particular idea, and they just go around spouting, you know, bromides that mean nothing. Why should they have a hard time getting together? They don't care about anything.
If you take the example of France, you have a very serious gap between those who supported de Gaulle during the war and those who were in favor of Pétain. Not that much in favor of the Nazis, but in favor of the fact that he, or their idea that he managed somehow to save the national sovereignty by collaborating with the Nazis. And we had, by the way, an extremely interesting debate coming this time from Zemmour, a Jew, on the role of Vichy in the Holocaust. Zemmour defending the idea, which
that was stunning. I mean, it made me think that he might actually be crazy. I mean, that was a stunning thing.
Actually, if you examine the facts, and I was recently working on a story that had to do with Polish diplomats saving Jews during the Holocaust here in France. And in the correspondence that they were having with the Foreign Office of Poland in London, they expressed very clearly already at the time the fact that the Vichy regime was doing all what he could in order to save the French Jews, or as they call it, our Jews, but were absolutely indifferent to the fact that the Nazis, not only indifferent, they also send the Nazis all the mainly Polish Jews that they wanted to get rid of, because this was a huge issue before the Second World War in France and in other countries, the immigration of Jews coming from Eastern Europe, which was not very welcome. So to a very large extent, Zemmour knew exactly what he was talking, but you still see the fact that people who were on a certain side during, or people who come from families who stood on a certain side during the Second World War, have extreme difficulties in accepting anything that has to do with the ideas of the other camp. Now, in France nowadays, actually, trying to surmount this division, everybody wants to be the successor of de Gaulle, which means that even Marine Le Pen, whose father was vocally for Pétain, she says that she represents nowadays nowadays the ideas of de Gaulle, the Republican ideas of de Gaulle. Zemmour is absolutely 100% a successor of de Gaulle. Everybody wants to be de Gaulle in this country, but their interpretations of what does it mean to be de Gaulle still makes it extremely difficult for the right to get unite. In the case of Le Pen, she has a problem with her family name. This is something that has to be said, and this is something that Zemmour says. He says that as long as there is a Le Pen in the campaign, they cannot win an election because the anti-feelings towards Le Pen because of her father are extremely alive and kicking.
So, all
And by
right.
the way,
I mean, there are two ways that we can take this conversation, and I'm trying to figure out which the best way is, because I think, from a political perspective, from an Israeli perspective, from a Jewish perspective, the right wing, when we look at what's happening on the political left throughout the Western world, that it's clear that Israel is better off with having right-wing parties in power. And yet the right can't really get its act together, and therefore you have the left seizing the reins in country after country and making them very anti-Semitic, or when the right wing rules, they're so incoherent that they end up losing power fairly quickly because they can't figure out what they're standing for or whether it matters even that they're in power. I mean, Merkel, like you said, she was carrying out the left-wing policies of the Greens and the Social Democrats for 16 years in power. And we saw it very clearly with her schizophrenic positions on Israel, where she was officially very pro-Israel. But in fact, Germany is one of the major financiers of BDS in Israel and throughout the world. And so, I mean, so on the one hand, we have the fragmentation and the weakness of the right in the West, and on the other hand, we have the radicalization of the left. So we've been talking about the right. Why don't we just move for a while to the left in France and in Germany and in Britain, where we're seeing the rise of the Red Green Alliance, very open anti-Semitism among left-wing parties. I remember when Macron won in 2017, you had these Islamists waving Palestinian flags at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, and so there's this incredible prominence of anti-Semitism that's manifested or legitimized or sold, peddled as hatred of Israel, but it's annihilationist anti-Semitism on the left. Is there any way to permeate that? Are there any fights on the left against this? I mean, where do you see this even going?
Look, I think the situation, the Israeli dilemma, shows itself very well in two positions. When there was a chance that Corbyn would become Prime Minister of Britain, the Israeli establishment and even the Jewish community in Britain did everything they could to open communication channels to the Corbyn camp, knowing that it's a very anti-Semitic camp. But they were preparing themselves for the eventuality that Corbyn would become prime minister, and that both Israel and the Jewish community would have to live with it. In France, where for the second time, Marine Le Pen becomes a serious candidate to the presidency of France, Israel and the Jewish community are totally boycotting Le Pen and her party, even boycotting Eric Zemmour and his party, which means that there is a problem in the approach of the official Israeli foreign policy towards the extreme left, which we know to be today anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli, anti-Zionist, and very pro-Muslim and Palestinian, and the national right, which in recent years in different European countries went through an evolution, an ideological evolution, and cannot be considered as anti-Semitic as what it used to be 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years ago.
Well, that's let me just stop you for a second. First of all, it's amazing how French Jewry is revolted by, is repulsed by Le Pen and Zemmour. I mean, they can't even, the concept that she could win, or that they should host him in their congregations, for him to address the Jewish community as a French Jew. It just it sounds outlandish to them. And the other thing is that I've asked, I don't know, and everybody that I find that lives in Germany, I haven't asked you yet, I'll ask you now, or works with the German right on any level. I said, well, what about the AfD? I mean, the Alternative for Deutschland, the far right party that nobody wants to sit with. They're incredibly pro-Israel. How anti-Semitic are they? And everybody says, well, they're pretty anti-Semitic, and so that at the end of the day, even though they're very pro-Israel, at least what I've been hearing from people who have no interest in saying that they're anti-Semitic is that, yes, in fact, sadly, they are. So, I mean, how do you, these two things, the Jewish revulsion at the right, and are they right to be revolted by it? I mean, are these people really, very proto-Nazi, not particularly appalled by the concept of Hitler, however you want to look at it? I mean, are these people that have to be kept at arm's length? How do you look at them? They're a challenge.
I've just finished a book about the Alternative for Germany. And
well, I can't wait to read it.
In Germany, I hope it will be published this coming summer. And I have been dealing quite intensively with the party, meeting with its leaders and trying to understand what's happening there, because I think that the Alternative for Germany is the most interesting political phenomenon in Germany in the last decades, because it really changed and reshaped the political landscape in Germany. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, that the right side of German politics doesn't have a majority, because it's completely boycotted by the conservative, the same way that some conservatives, or large part of the conservatives here in France, still boycott Le Pen and Zemmour. Regarding the Jewish attitude there, I think there's a big difference between the official bodies, the leadership of the community, which opposes to every contact with these sort of parties, and the members of the communities. I've met here in France in the last month and even before many people who openly supported Zemmour. They had some problems with voting for Le Pen because of her father, but they completely adhere to the ideology which is presented by those persons. And I think that it's also the same situation in Germany. You have to understand that both in Germany, mainly in France, the Jews are being felt left alone, left aside by the authorities. They have been the target of repeated attacks, violent attacks, physical and verbal, by the main threat to Jews in Europe nowadays, which is coming from Arab and Muslim communities. And the authorities have done absolutely nothing to avoid it. Here in France, we've seen some cases, some horrible cases, like the case of the murder of Sarah Halimi, where the authorities did everything possible not to put to trial the person, the Muslim African young person who savagely, barbarically murdered this elderly Jewish doctor and teacher. So they feel completely left alone, and they are looking for other somebody who would represent them on the political level, and the right, far right, national right parties in those countries seem to be the answer for this problem. Now, to what extent are they, like in Germany, are they a continuation of the Nazi ideology and thought? It's extremely difficult. I don't think that we will have the time to discuss it. Maybe we'll discuss it when the book comes out.
Be very happy to do that. Very happy.
Nationalism in Germany has become something that you don't want after Second World War. And every national orientation was immediately branded as Nazi. Nowadays, we get into a situation where everybody who is not thinking politically correct in Germany, also in Israel, and in other places, is being branded as a Nazi. This is a very dangerous development, because at the end of the day, you have many people who are absolutely not Nazis, who voted for the Alternative for Germany, like 2017, when they became the third biggest party in the German parliament. You had over 1 million voters coming from the Conservative Party, over 1 million voters, around 1 million voters coming from the Social Democratic Party, voters coming from the Greens, voters coming from the Die Linke, the radical left.
What are they attracted by?
Nazis? Sorry?
I said, what are they attracted by?
They attracted, first of all, by it's a protest vote, okay? They were looking for something else. They were extremely unhappy, and this is exactly the situation that we have nowadays in France. They were extremely unhappy with a government which was a mixture of right and wing, and came up with policies that were imposed on the population, like what we have in France during the Corona crisis. And they said, you know, Merkel at the time kept on saying, there is no other alternative. We have to pay for the bricks, we have to save the euro, we have to accept the hundreds of thousands of so-called refugees coming from the Middle East. There is no other alternative. So actually what they say is that she acted in violating the constitution, because she had absolutely no legal right to do what she did. Her only explanation was there is no other alternative. So they came up and said, hey guys, there is another alternative. And the other alternative was Alternative for Germany. Now, among the Alternative for Germany, there are very different political and ideological streams of the German right. You have the liberals, you have the conservatives, you have the national Germans, and you also have, I would say, certain amount of persons who were extremely connected with extreme right movements, organizations, and parties. Until now, I do not think that they were representing the majority of members and representatives of the Alternative for Germany. Take, for example, one of the leaders of the party, Alexander Gauland, who was born in East Germany and then fled to West Germany and was very active in the Conservative Party, and left it because of his disapproval to the policies of Merkel, and helped found the Alternative for Germany. He had a speech some years ago where he said that the 12 years of Nazi regime was, I don't know how you call it in English, was the shit of birds in the long German history, meaning
totally inconsequential,
not very important period, and really stinking period in the now. Immediately, he was accused of trying to reduce the importance of the Holocaust and the Nazi crimes. While as if you look, and nobody did it, at the integrity of his speech, he actually starts in praising all the Jews who contributed to the history of Germany, to the development of Germany, to the economy of Germany. So he starts in he speaks about the contributions of Jews. Nobody pays attention to it. And then he says that the 12 years of Nazi regime were birds shit, and everybody speaks only about that and accuses him of being anti-Semitic. And this automatic machinization of accusing everybody who is national of being Nazi in Germany, but also here in France and in other countries. We see it in Hungary, we see it in Poland, is extremely, extremely problematic, because by doing so, you reduce the ability to accuse those who are really Nazis. Because if everybody who thinks differently is Nazi, so, maybe it's an accepted phenomenon.
It's one of those weird things, right? Because I think he's wrong. I mean, I think his analysis is wrong. The Jews did play a very important role in German history, but so did anti-Semitism. And in the final analysis, as far as I can see, anti-Semitism was far more decisive, as we saw with the final solution to the Jewish problem in places like Auschwitz. And so it's very true that Jews played a very prominent role over the years, over the centuries in Germany in various ways, but they were also consistently and harshly and murderously persecuted through the ages. And in many, many ways, Nazism was a natural outgrowth of the way that German society developed. And so it wasn't bird shit for 12 years. I mean, it was very much an apotheosis of Germanic identity and German politics. And so I think that you could look at that and say that is on the other hand, you can say that people who are trying to pretend that Nazism was sui generis, that it wasn't endemic, it wasn't organic to Germany, are trying to figure out a way to redefine Germany in a manner that will eschew anti-Semitism, that will reject anti-Semitism, that says that we are not that way, that we want to be completely different. And maybe that's the beginning of a reckoning of sorts, which is important. What I find funny is that I think at a very deep level what he said was incorrect, but I think that the people who pounced on him have absolutely no interest in really, considering the meaning or the centrality of the Holocaust or the organic nature of the Holocaust, not first and foremost to German society and identity, but also really to the larger European identity of the collaborationists in various countries, in all the countries. And and that really does go to a question of, if you don't have a moral reckoning with the Holocaust, then what are you really left with? And, that was on one thought that I had on him. But the other thought is, if it's a grab bag of people on the right and even on the left, one of the concerns that you can have as an Israeli or as a Jew in these countries is that you did see, with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and others, that you do have a convergence of the far left and the far right. We see it in the United States in ultranationalists in circles on the right that like David Duke, the former the Ku Klux Klan leader, he tweets out Ilhan Omar's tweets and is very supportive of her and of Rashida Tlaib. And so you see this conjoining of the far left and the far right. And so when you talk about what's going to happen in the French parliamentary elections in June, and that if Macron is the default guy that can stand for everything because he stands for nothing and he governs kind of like by his mood swings or whatever, then you're going to have this very extreme parliament that's going to be, I mean, extreme is a boring word at this point, but be very ideological parliament of far leftists and nationalists on the right of various stripes. And, maybe that's also really bad for the Jews. I mean, I don't know, maybe the milquetoast, the nothings, the people who are just going along to get along are the best that you can hope for. I don't know. Maybe I'm just giving you a hodgepodge of observations that don't amount to a question, but I'm not really sure what to make of all of this. Is really
I'm going back to what Alexander Galland said, because I think it's important to discuss it. You don't have to agree with it. You can criticize it. You can criticize it. There's absolutely no problem with it. But you really have to consider the fact that there are more and more Germans. Maybe there were always quite a lot of Germans who were saying, excuse me, but our history is not only these 12 years of Nazism. And reducing German history into the 12 years of Nazism makes it impossible for us to feel proud of our nation. And our nation is much more than these 12 years. And this is what they're saying. You have to go back to the Prussian history. You have to go back to the achievements which were made by German-speaking persons in the 19th century, before the Second World War, after the Second World War. You have to start looking a little bit beyond the Holocaust and Second World War and the Nazi period. You also have it here in France. People who say, like Zemmour, that if you keep on saying that France was, through Vichy, was responsible for the persecution and death of French Jews, you keep on blaming France as a whole and the French population for something that they haven't done, and you reduce the historical discussion.
Okay, let me. I see what you're saying, and I think. Wait. Let me just ask you one question, and then I promise I won't interrupt you again. So I think my problem is that I'm looking at this as an Israeli, and so I'm thinking, well, what do you really think about the Jews? And what you're saying, what they're saying, or what you're saying that they're saying, hey, look at us as a whole. Look at us as a whole Germanic society, a whole Francophone society, or the history, the long history of France, and we've done so many things. We've been so many things. Let's look at the whole of our society and let's embrace that. And so my view of it is I'm looking at it as a Jew and looking at only the fact that that anti-Semitism was so central to so much of their identity along the lines. But what you're saying is that they're trying to save their national identity by rebuilding it, by reacquainting themselves with the full span of who they are. That's what you're saying, right?
I think that we can see this problematic very, very good in the Polish example, because here you have very parallel narratives between the Polish side and the Israeli side on what happened during Second World War. And unfortunately, these two lines cannot meet, or both sides are not doing enough to sit down together and to talk seriously and factually about what happened. Now, having this discussion doesn't mean that we are going to whitewash all the Polish nation or all Poles of certain things that were done by certain Poles during the Second World War. However, coming and saying that the Polish state, or which never existed, which didn't exist during the Second World War, or the Polish nation as a whole persecuted the Jews, was responsible for the murder of Jews, collaborated with the Nazis. Well, we know that the numbers of Poles who saved Jews is the largest among all European nations. While we know nowadays that Polish diplomats were very actively working in order to save Jews during the Second World War. While we know that the camps, the death camps, were not operated by Poles, but by Germans and other collaborators, like, for example, the Ukrainian one. Yeah. So accusing what happened with the time, and there are certain reasons for it, is that we have pardoned Germany, whereas Germany didn't really deserve pardoning that quickly, especially when you see how they act against Israel these days in many, many ways. And we have put all the blame on Poland. We are accusing Poland of the Holocaust, which was committed by the Germans. Since we don't have any dialogue between both sides, any reasonable dialogue, but we based ourselves only on prejudgments and emotions, we have absolutely no way of understanding what happened in Poland during the Second World War. What was the role of Poles, non-Jews Poles, in exposing the Holocaust to the outside world, outside of Europe, even inside Europe itself? We are absolutely ignorant on what Poles have done in order to save Jews. Now, saying that doesn't mean that all Jews were, all Poles were just among the nations. It's absolutely not the case, and we know of many cases where Poles were giving Jews away, and even murdering Jews. But we have to stop thinking, first of all, in this white and black way of seeing history. We have to see how complicated and complex the situation was. And secondly, I think that when it comes to Israel's foreign policy, I really think that we are acting a little bit like children, looking for parents or surrounding love, and not understanding that foreign policy is based on interests, not on morality.
I don't want to interrupt you here again. I want to. No, actually, you go on, and then I'll say what I need to say. Go.
I think that for this reason, Israel has because Israel doesn't really have a foreign policy, but is more acting like a shtetl community somewhere in East Europe, looking for the grace of the governor. We are actually putting ourselves in a very difficult situation when it comes to Europe. And the boycott, the overall boycott of national right parties like Le Pen's party and Eric Zemmour's party,
not to mention Orban, right?
Is not helping Israel, because look, I'm not necessarily for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. However, in the last 5 years, they have enabled Israel to show the hypocrisy of the official German policy towards Israel. And they have done this by putting on different resolutions in the German parliament, like the issue of the BDS. They were the first one to initiate the BDS resolution. And they came up with a resolution which was much and far more binding than the one that at the end was accepted. The Hezbollah issue. They brought up the Hezbollah issue, stopping all, or making illegal
the ban on Hezbollah, both the foreign policy wing or whatever, and the militant wing and the civil charitable wing.
And the coalition parties actually objected to this idea.
Right.
Few weeks afterwards, they came with their own resolution on it. And at the end of the day, we have a ban on Hezbollah activities in Germany, which means that at the end of the day, a party that we are not talking to, that we are actually boycotting, was helping the Israeli interests in Germany much more than all our good friends in Germany. So we really have to rethink our attitude. I'm not saying that we have to speak with everybody. I'm not saying that we have to go to bed with every political party. But what I'm saying is that it's impossible that we are trying to have communication channels with radical lefts who are openly anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist, and we boycott national right parties that are pro-Israeli in such a way that they oppose the ban on products coming from Judea and Samaria. They support the sovereignty of Israel in Judea and Samaria. And they say that Jerusalem should be the capital of Israel. These parties are being boycotted by the Israeli government only because we have some suspicions about the motives of these positions.
I think that what you're saying is so vital and so important, and I've said and written this myself on many occasions, and I think that it is the key point both for Israelis and for Jews in these countries and throughout the world when looking at these people. When you, particularly the point about the parallel lines that they don't meet. That's one important point that you made, and the other important point you made was that Israel gave moral license or legitimacy to post-war Germany when there was no moral reckoning with the Holocaust on the part of Adenauer, who had a Nazi, a very high person in his chancery and other things. I mean, that we did need Germany in the 1950s. I don't think that Ben-Gurion was wrong in what he did. But that's not on an emotional level. And I think that the problem that Israelis have, you're absolutely right, our foreign policy establishment has, is both that they're captive of the European left, and they have been really since the 1950s, and they don't understand that they don't really understand what a national interest is. I think you're right, the shtetl mentality that dominates Israeli policy. But I think that the key point that you made here was the parallel tracks. I don't know how easy it would be to come to agreement with the Poles about what happened in Poland during the Holocaust. I'm not sure that it would be possible, but the question is, I think the big challenge for Israelis, whether we're looking at Germany or we're looking at France or we're looking at Holland or anywhere else, is whether we can recognize that the Holocaust is something that was done to the Jews. We were victims of the Holocaust. It's not our story in the sense that we didn't do it. We had it done to us. In 4,000 years of Jewish history, we were the actors determining our way in this world most of the time, but some of the time we were being acted upon and we were completely powerless. And we have to take our lessons from what happened to us in the Holocaust as Jews and move forward as Jews with the lessons that powerlessness is a disaster and it leads to annihilation, and that we need our state and we need to protect ourselves and we need the means to protect ourselves by ourselves, and that being the primary thing, which is Israel. But that we operate in a world that is populated by the people who carried out the Holocaust. And and that when we come to speak to them, we have to be able to speak to them in a way that lets the state of Israel, the empowered Jewish people of today, the sovereign Jewish people of today, operate harmoniously or in an advantageous way for the Jewish state and the Jewish people with the offspring of Nazis and their collaborators, and help them where possible come to reckon with their past, and where not possible, just concentrate on what we can do, which is to keep ourselves strong and diminish to the extent possible their ability to harm us. I mean, I think that the parallel lines here is a very important metaphor for going forward, because not everything, when you're talking to the Poles, has to be about Auschwitz. It can also be about Iran, as we saw with the conference that the Poles had hosted, which was a key moment, was a critical point in Middle Eastern history and in Israeli-European ties and in Israeli-American ties, that the Poles hosted a U.S.-Israeli Arab conference on how to fight Iran. That was an extraordinary event that took place. And we get a lot from a strategic partnership with Poland, regardless of how their histrionics or lack thereof about the role of Poles in World War II, and we harm ourselves in a devastating way when we're not able to recognize that, and I think that you're right, and I really look forward to reading about the AFD, because they're so alluring for me, personally, that I think, well, can we work with them? And what about all of these? What about the anti-Semitism in that party, and how important is it? And at the end of the day, you have to also be able to look and say, well, why don't we live in the current moment for long enough to get what we can out of our relationship with Germany?
Yeah, well, I would maybe conclude with 2 points. First of all, about Poland, I do think that a dialogue with them, a historical dialogue with them, is vital.
But is it possible, when they're passing laws that immediately get everybody's hackles up and say, well, we can't talk about the Holocaust, you're going to see, and everybody becomes so emotional, and they're emotional, it's an emotional law. I mean, can you have a reasoned debate in this kind of atmosphere?
It's not true. It's they first of all, what was presented in Israel as the Holocaust law never really existed as it was presented in Israel, and even that was annulled and cancelled by the Polish authorities, which means that it would be essential for historians of both sides to sit down and try to build a common narrative of what happened during the Second World War, with all the complexity of all the issues that have to do with it, and stop basing ourselves on ideas that have nothing to do with reality. It's true that
nothing to do with reality. Nothing to do with reality.
Well, when you say that the death camps were Polish death camps, it has nothing to do with reality. Okay. And if I'm not wrong, correct me, please, if I'm wrong. This is something that our foreign minister, Lapid, said at the time, and something that caused in a very serious way the damage that we are still leaving to the relations between both countries. So no, the death camps were German death camps. And by the way, I think that one of the ways of building future sane relations between us and the Poles would be to enlarge the trips that Israeli pupils are doing nowadays. Well, it's stopped now, but mainly to the death camps in Poland, to enlarge it to Germany. You have to see the whole process. You cannot just concentrate. I mean, it's exactly like what I said about the Germans at the beginning of this talk, that you have to see the whole process, not only the Holocaust is not just Auschwitz or Majdanek or Sobibor. You have to see where it started. You have to go to even to Beirut. You have to go to Nuremberg. You have to go to Berlin. You have to go to Wannsee. You have to go to Dachau. You have to go to Sachsenhausen. You have to understand how this whole thing came into being, and only then go to Poland. Because if you concentrate yourself on Poland, you get the wrong impression that it was the Holocaust was a Polish thing, and it was a German thing. And if you say that we don't have money to organize or to enlarge these trips, so here is a tip. All the money that the Germans are giving to anti-Israeli activities could be invested in such an initiative, which would make a rapprochement possible between Israelis, Germans, and Poles. I would love to see the reaction of Germans living in Munich, in Berlin, in Frankfurt, when they see thousands of Israeli youngsters coming with Israeli flags, not with Palestinian flags, with Israeli flags. I would like to see their reaction. And I think that it would be such a thing, would improve eventually relations between both countries, which are, I believe, as bad as, at the end of the day, on the popular level, are as bad as their relations with the Poles. This is something that is extremely important, in my opinion.
Okay, let me just ask you a final question, and before we say so long, I also have a public service announcement that I have to make, that I was supposed to make at the beginning, but I'm going to make it at the end. But when you look at the German society, the German ability to, I'm not talking about AfD, actually, I'm talking about the Merkel Germans, the Olaf Scholz Germans, their ability to avoid reckoning with the Holocaust by blaming it on the Poles, and then their central role in the whole anti-Israel demonization of Israel, the BDS movement, by funding all of these groups, including the Israeli groups like Breaking the Silence, who were part of the petition against the anti-BDS resolution from the Bundestag. So they're funding all of this. And so the question that I ask you is this: you live in Berlin, you've lived there for many, many years. How central do you think that this German subversion, this political, this hidden, very badly hidden war that they're continuing to wage against the Jews through their political war against Israel, how much of an impact is that having on Europe? How much of are they a leader in Europe's anti-Semitism, their anti-Zionism, or are they part of a larger whole? Are the French leftists who are waving Palestinian flags by the Arc de Triomphe, are they leaders in the same level as the Germans, or are they being led? How do you see the division of power on the far left and in the just basic gestalt of anti-Israelism in Europe? Is it led by anybody in particular, or is it continental?
Well, thank you for reminding me the second point that I wanted to bring up at the conclusion of the talk. Well, definitely Germany is playing an important role in advocating behind the scene, or not being active enough behind the scene in preventing anti-Israeli decisions of the EU on all the different levels of the EU. The official EU, the EU Parliament, the European Parliament, etc. The Germans are sometimes playing an active role in promoting anti-Israeli decisions, and sometimes are just, observe and do nothing, despite the fact that they say that you have like the Czech Republic, Czechia, Hungary, and Austria, who were extremely much more active in recent years in trying to stop anti-Israeli resolutions and initiatives. On the anti-Semitic thing, I cannot accuse the Germans of any leading part, but I think that they really haven't done enough, as they should have, in order, first of all, to make the EU recognize the fact that the most problematic anti-Semitic phenomenon of these days is coming from Muslim and Arab countries. Too many European countries are silencing this phenomenon. And while as they should have confronted it and talked about it, and they should have fought it in a very serious way, because at the end of the day, this is a threat that begins with the Jewish communities and then goes on, as we see, to the other communities, the non-Jewish communities in those countries. The most important thing for Israel, I think, when we are dealing with Germany and other EU countries, especially Western EU countries, is coming to them and telling them very openly, guys, first of all, you have absolutely no right to intervene in our internal affairs. Point. You are not to do it. And Israel has to be sovereign enough to stop all the ways of European intervention, European and even American intervention in Israeli policies. This is something that we have to stop. And they actually have to understand why they shouldn't interfere in our affairs. And the second point should be, if you say that you are our friends, we want to see it. We really want to see it, because friends have to act in a certain way. And even if we talk about Germany, at the end of the day, they're not acting in a friendly way. They are voting against Israel. They are financing anti-Israeli activities in many, many, many ways. This is not the way friends work and cooperate. And nowadays, the Europeans are much more depending on the cooperation with Israel, because Israel has too many things to contribute to Europeans on many levels. So the balance of power between us and them, which was of large dependence in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, has changed drastically. And I think that if they want to go on cooperating with us, it's time that they start working against us.
Look, I agree. I think we've really come to the end, and I think that, if we want to, first of all, thank you so much for doing this show with me. I think it's very important to talk to you on Yom HaShoah for this program, and just in general to kind of understand there's a lot of stuff that makes the waters of Israeli-European relations very murky. The Holocaust being one of them. Another one is obviously the economic leverage that the Europeans have developed towards Israel over the years, which is significant and gives pause to a lot of political leaders when they're wondering how much they can stand up to Europe. And of course, we have an idiot in charge of our foreign ministry right now, in Yair Lapid, who is just a very superficial kind of guy who doesn't think anything through and just goes with what he thinks is going to sound good on TV and what's going to make his friends in the Democrat Party happy. So I think he's really been a pyromaniac in Israeli diplomacy, and he's not alone. We have a lot of them. But I think that I think you're right. I think that your way of looking at things, and my own, if I may say so, is that morality is extremely important. But it's if it's the be all and end all of your foreign policy, it's not going to get you that far, because particularly in Israeli-European ties, the Jewish victimization is the only clear thing, and a lot of other things are complicated. I mean, it's clear what the end state was, how we got there, who was responsible, who was not responsible, how responsible the responsible parties were at various levels, and what that means. are things that are going to stop us in our tracks every time if we make that an obstacle in 2022 to having the cooperative and equal relations that we want to have as a sovereign power with the Europeans, and also as the Jewish state that also has a special responsibility to protect Jewish minorities in throughout the world. So I think you're right. And I do just want, so first of all, thank you so much for joining me today. I think I learned a lot from you, and I'm sure that my audience probably learned. I mean, I'm sure that you guys all learned a lot from Eldad Beck. So thank you. I do just want to, I have to, a piece of housekeeping I was supposed to tell you. On May 26th, the Tikva Fund, which is a friend of this webcast, is going to be holding a very important conference in Jerusalem that I'm going to be speaking at as well, along with a lot more important people than myself. And you can get it. We're going to have a link at the bottom of this podcast for a coupon that you can check on for being a viewer or a listener to the Carolyn Glick Middle East News Hour, and you can get a reduced price for tickets to join us. If you're going to be in Jerusalem, you can also get Zoom tickets, I think, for a reduced price. So check it out. The link is right there on the thing. I think that the 10 days between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut are time for Jews, for Israelis, for friends of Israel to reflect, and for people who were really challenged all over the Western world by questions of what sovereignty is and what a nation state is today, in particular, in a way that, like you said, is fundamental to our future. I think that we all have to take time to think about what happened to the Jewish people in Europe from 1939, and obviously further back than that, and 1945 with the Holocaust, and then what we've built since then here in the land of Israel with the state of Israel. And there's obvious, the contrasts are so stark, but if there's anything to learn here, it's that the Jewish people need power, and as much as possible. So I appreciate very much you joining me, and we'll have you back when your book comes out so that we can do a much deeper dive into the AFD, which is an important phenomenon in and of itself. Thank you so much. Thank you all, and we'll see you next week.